The most dangerous mistake a proud man can make is believing the woman he once broke is still the same woman standing in front of him. Ethan Bennett believed exactly that the moment he spotted Claire across the Grand Crescent Ballroom in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers cast warm gold over the charity gala. Servers moved between tables carrying sparkling water and plated hors d'oeuvres, and nearly 200 guests in tailored evening wear filled the room with polished laughter and business small talk. Ethan stood at the center of it all like he belonged there, because in many ways, he did. As founder of a fast-growing real estate investment firm, he had spent the last 3 years rebuilding not just his finances, but his image. Successful, respected, untouchable. At least that was the story he told the world. Then he saw Claire. For half a second, he genuinely looked confused, like he had seen a ghost who somehow knew the dress code. Claire Bennett stood near the entrance in a navy evening dress, elegant but understated, one hand resting lightly over a silver clutch. She wasn't trying to draw attention. If anything, she looked like someone who might quietly slip in, make a donation, and leave unnoticed. Ethan's expression shifted almost instantly from surprise to amusement. "No way," muttered the man beside him. "Is that your ex?" Ethan smirked. Apparently. A few nearby guests followed his gaze. Whispers started the way they always do in expensive rooms, soft enough to seem polite, sharp enough to cut. Ethan took a slow sip from his glass without looking away from her. "I didn't know charity events allowed emotional baggage." The comment earned a few chuckles. Claire heard it. He knew she did. She gave no reaction. That, more than anything, annoyed him. Because Ethan remembered a different Claire. A Claire who explained herself. A Claire who cried in private. A Claire who tried to fix conversations already designed for her to lose. This version simply stood there, calm, scanning the room as if she belonged. Ethan hated that. "Excuse me," he said, already moving toward the event coordinator near the stage. 10 minutes later, after the keynote wrapped and applause faded, Ethan found himself holding a wireless microphone beneath a spotlight. "Before we continue," he said smoothly, smiling at the crowd, "I just want to recognize an unexpected guest tonight." Heads turned immediately. Claire looked up. "My former wife, Claire Bennett, has joined us this evening." Polite applause started, uncertain and scattered. Ethan continued before it could settle. "Always nice when people reconnect with circles they used to be part of." That got more laughter. Claire didn't move. "You know," Ethan said, pacing slightly, "resilience is inspiring. Some people lose everything and still somehow find valet parking." Stronger laughter now. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody interrupted. Public embarrassment has a strange social gravity. People often wait to see how far it will go. Ethan saw momentum building and leaned into it. Claire always had incredible timing, especially when successful people were nearby. More laughter. Claire remained completely still. No angry face. No tears. No attempt to leave. Just calm. Ethan's confidence expanded with every silent second. Then Claire glanced down at her phone. Just once. A message appeared. Her thumb moved briefly. Then she looked back up. Something about that tiny moment should have warned him. It didn't. Ethan smiled into the microphone. "Actually," he said, voice sharpening with performative charm, "why don't we hear from Claire herself?" The room quieted. A server paused mid-step. Someone near the back turned fully toward her. Ethan extended the microphone slightly, not enough for her to take it, just enough to make the humiliation feel complete. "Come on, Claire," he said. "Don't be shy." Claire met his eyes for the first time that night. And instead of looking hurt, she looked prepared. Most people in that ballroom assumed silence meant weakness. That was always Ethan's favorite misunderstanding. Claire knew that because she had spent 8 years married to a man who treated perception like currency. Ethan never needed people to know the truth. He only needed them to believe his version first. In the early years, that talent had looked like confidence. When Claire first met him at a mutual friend's rooftop birthday party in Lincoln Park, he had been magnetic in the way ambitious men often are. He remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, held doors open, and made everyone feel briefly more interesting in his presence. Claire had been working as a project coordinator for a nonprofit arts foundation then, practical, organized, and far less impressed by flashy personalities than most of her friends. But Ethan had persistence, and more importantly, patience. He learned what made people trust him. With Claire it was consistency, weekly calls, thoughtful coffee deliveries, remembering details she had mentioned once in passing. He made effort look effortless. Her mother adored him. Her co-workers said she looked happier. By the time he proposed 18 months later, nobody questioned whether he was the right choice, including Claire. The changes came slowly enough to feel accidental. Ethan would correct small things first. That story is funnier if you tell it this way. You are overthinking what she meant. You always assume the worst. Little edits to her perspective. Little adjustments to her confidence. When she pushed back, he smiled like she was being dramatic. When she apologized, peace returned. It became a pattern so gradually she barely saw it forming. Ethan liked environments he controlled. Restaurants he chose. Friends he approved of. Vacations built around networking opportunities disguised as leisure. If Claire expressed discomfort, he reframed it as insecurity. If she asked for honesty, he called it interrogation. Publicly, he remained impeccable. Privately, he specialized in making her question her own memory. Nothing explosive. Nothing obvious. Just endless emotional redirection until defending herself felt exhausting. Friends noticed she had become quieter. Ethan explained that marriage matured people. Claire believed maybe he was right. The hardest relationships to understand are often the ones that do not look broken from the outside. Their house in Hinsdale looked like success. Holiday cards looked perfect. Dinner parties sounded effortless. Ethan loved hosting because admiration energized him. Claire became part spouse, part set decoration. Smile, he would whisper before guests entered. Not cruelly. Worse, casually. As if happiness were a logistical requirement. The divorce, when it came, shocked everyone except Claire. Ethan framed it as unfortunate incompatibility. He told people they had grown apart. He told others he had tried everything. A few implied Claire had struggled emotionally after the marriage. He never directly lied if implication worked just as well. Claire had learned something by then. Fighting every false impression only made her look unstable. So she left quietly. Signed what needed signing. Found a modest apartment in the city. Rebuilt routines one ordinary day at a time. Ethan assumed that meant he had won. In truth, Claire had simply stopped performing pain for an audience that rewarded his version of events. Standing in that ballroom now, she remembered the first time Ethan humiliated her in public. It had happened at a company dinner years ago when she accidentally misremembered the name of one of his investors. Ethan laughed and corrected her with exaggerated charm. The table laughed too. On the drive home, she said he embarrassed her. He replied, "If that embarrassed you, maybe you should prepare better." She spent years preparing better. It never changed the outcome. Across the ballroom, Ethan still held the microphone, still smiling with that same polished confidence, unaware that the rules had changed. "Come on, Claire," he repeated. "You always had something to say at home." A ripple of laughter followed. Claire noticed different reactions now. Not everyone was amused. A woman near the center table looked down at her drink. An older man near the donor board frowned. Social tides can shift quietly before anyone acknowledges them. Ethan mistook silence for support. "No response," he asked. "That is new." Claire remembered another conversation, 6 months after the divorce, when a former mutual acquaintance ran into her at a grocery store and said, "I am so sorry things fell apart." Ethan seemed devastated. She had nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Not because heartbreak cannot be real, but because Ethan mourned lost control more than lost relationships. Claire had learned to identify that distinction. She also learned something else after the divorce. People eventually reveal themselves when they think the story is over. Ethan had made assumptions. Dangerous ones. That she remained isolated. That she remained intimidated. That she had no reason to return to rooms like this. That if she did, she would shrink under pressure the way she once had. He had no idea tonight was not an accident. Claire shifted her silver clutch slightly and looked toward the back of the room. A man in a charcoal suit had just entered, speaking quietly with event staff. Ethan had not noticed him yet. Claire's phone vibrated once in her hand. Confirmation. Timing aligned. Ethan stepped closer to the edge of the stage area. "You know what is fascinating?" he asked the room. "Some people disappear for years, then show up exactly where successful people gather." The line earned less laughter this time. He noticed, adjusted, and smiled broader. "I am kidding. Mostly." Claire looked directly at him, calm enough that his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That was the first crack. Ethan expected embarrassment. He understood anger. He knew tears. He did not understand composure from someone he believed he had fully mapped. "You look different," he said, trying to reclaim footing. Claire answered with the smallest smile. Not warmth. Recognition. Ethan felt it and disliked it immediately. Because for the first time that evening, he had the strange sensation that he was no longer leading the moment. The shift in the room was subtle enough that only someone used to watching people closely would notice it, and Ethan had always believed he was that person. But confidence can make observation lazy. He saw faces turn toward him and assumed attention meant agreement. He heard silence and assumed approval. What he missed were the details. The woman near the donor table whispering to her husband. The event coordinator no longer smiling. The older gentleman in the navy tuxedo, checking his phone after glancing from Claire to Ethan with a look that suggested recognition rather than amusement. Ethan lifted the microphone again, determined to recover momentum. "I have to say," he said with a polished laugh, "this is almost nostalgic." Claire standing there judging me while saying absolutely nothing. A few restrained laughs answered him, thinner than before. Claire remained still. That unnerved him more than any argument would have. "Nothing." Ethan tilted his head. "That is disappointing." Then he made the mistake ambitious men often make when they feel control slipping. He escalated. "You always wanted people to think you were misunderstood," he said. "But maybe some stories end exactly the way they should." The words landed heavier than he intended. A woman in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the back quietly muttered, "That is enough." Ethan ignored it. Pride has a remarkable ability to filter inconvenient signals. Claire glanced once toward the ballroom entrance. The man in the charcoal suit had moved farther inside now, speaking with another attendee Ethan clearly knew, because when Ethan finally noticed them, his expression flickered. Just briefly, then vanished. He turned back to Claire. "Actually," he said, forcing a smoother tone, "let us make this fair." Claire always believed context mattered. He smiled at the audience. "Should we let her explain herself?" A few uncertain claps followed, more social reflex than enthusiasm. Ethan extended the microphone farther this time. Claire took a single step forward, but did not reach for it yet. "That is what I thought," Ethan said, trying to fill the hesitation. Still selective about when to speak. Then a voice from the right side of the room interrupted. "Ethan." It was not loud. It did not need to be. Ethan turned. A man in his early 60s stood from one of the premium sponsor tables, silver-haired, composed, with the kind of quiet authority that makes people instinctively stop talking. Claire recognized him immediately. Richard Halston, chairman of one of the largest private investment groups in Illinois. Ethan knew him too. The confidence in his shoulders adjusted almost instantly. "Richard," Ethan said, smiling. "Good to see you." Richard did not smile back. "Do you know her?" he asked, looking toward Claire. Ethan laughed lightly, trying to control the framing. "My ex-wife." Richard's expression changed in a way Ethan could not immediately interpret. Not surprise, not curiosity, something closer to recalculation. Ethan felt it. The room felt it. Claire finally stepped closer. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "Yes," she said. "We have met." Ethan stared at her, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no hesitation, no strain, no defensive energy at all, just certainty. Richard gave a small nod that confirmed something Ethan clearly did not understand. "I thought so," he said. Ethan laughed again, thinner now. Well, Chicago is a small world. But nobody laughed with him. The social temperature had changed completely, and for the first time that evening, Ethan could feel it happening in real time without knowing why. Claire looked at him with unsettling calm, while Ethan held a microphone that suddenly felt far less powerful than it had 5 minutes earlier. If Ethan had walked away in that moment, the night might have ended with only mild embarrassment. But men who build their identities around control rarely recognize the exact second they should stop talking. Ethan forced a smile and adjusted his grip on the microphone as though nothing significant had changed. "Well," he said with a short laugh, "apparently Claire has been making influential friends." The line landed flat. Nobody helped him. Richard Halston remained standing, expression unreadable. Claire noticed the tiny pulse moving in Ethan's jaw. That was new. For years, she had watched him recover from awkward situations with effortless speed. He could charm investors after failed pitches, win over skeptical acquaintances in minutes. reframe uncomfortable truths before they fully formed. Tonight, for the first time, his timing felt off. Richard, Ethan continued, trying again. I had no idea you knew each other. Richard answered simply. Professionally. That single word changed the air. Ethan blinked. Professionally? Claire could almost see his mind racing through possibilities. He had spent years assuming he understood the limits of her world after the divorce. Smaller apartment. Lower visibility. Fewer shared connections. A quieter life. He had mistaken privacy for irrelevance. Claire remembered exactly when the shift had started. 11 months earlier, she had attended a community fundraising breakfast for a literacy initiative, not because she expected opportunity, but because an old colleague asked her to help organize donor outreach. It was the kind of event Ethan would have dismissed as too small to matter. Folding chairs. Modest coffee service. Local sponsors instead of elite names. Claire had stayed late helping stack printed materials when Richard Halston struck up a conversation after noticing how smoothly the event had run despite several logistical problems. You handled that well, he had said. Claire thanked him, assuming it was polite small talk. Instead, he asked what she did professionally. For the first time in years, Claire answered without filtering her competence through someone else's ego. One conversation became another. Then consulting work. Then introductions. Then projects. Quiet ones at first. Strategy support for nonprofit expansion initiatives. Donor coordination. Event restructuring. Operational problem solving. Claire had always been capable. Ethan had simply occupied too much emotional space for her to use that capability fully. Richard became less a mentor than a witness to what happened when she no longer apologized for existing. None of that had required revenge. None of it had been built for this moment. But when Claire learned 2 weeks earlier that Ethan's firm would be heavily represented at tonight's gala, she understood something immediately. Ethan plus public attention plus unresolved ego created predictable chemistry. She had debated attending at all. Richard had been the one to ask a simple question over coffee. If avoiding a room is the only way to preserve your peace, is the room the problem? She attended because she no longer wanted geography determining her confidence. The confrontation itself had been Ethan's choice. Claire, Ethan said now, forcing casual amusement. You never mentioned your impressive new circle. Claire almost smiled at the absurdity. We have not exactly been sharing updates. A few guests exhaled small laughs at that. Ethan heard it. Claire saw the irritation flash behind his polished expression. Fair enough, he said. Still, I think everyone appreciates transparency. There it was again. His instinct to weaponize audience dynamics. Claire knew the pattern. If uncertainty entered the room, Ethan filled it with performance. Transparency, Claire repeated evenly. That is an interesting word. Ethan ignored the edge in her tone. I am just saying, he continued. It is amazing how people reinvent themselves. Richard's gaze sharpened. People can, he said. That is generally considered healthy. Several heads turned toward him. Ethan gave a tight smile. Of course. Claire's phone vibrated once inside her clutch. Another confirmation. The second timing marker. Everything was aligning almost exactly as expected, though even now she had not fully decided how far this would go. That depended on Ethan. It always had. You know, Ethan said, trying to recover social control. I may have been unfair. The audience relaxed slightly, expecting retreat. Ethan smiled. Claire was always very good at positioning herself. The room tensed again. Claire almost admired the consistency. Even when offered an exit, he chose escalation dressed as humor. That is enough, said the older woman near the donor table, softly but audibly. Ethan pretended not to hear. Tell me, he said directly to Claire. What exactly brings you here tonight? It sounded like a question. It was not. It was a demand disguised as civility. Claire answered honestly. Work. Ethan laughed. Doing what? Before Claire could respond, Richard answered for her. Advising. Ethan turned sharply. Advising? Richard nodded. On strategic philanthropic partnerships, among other things. Ethan looked from Richard to Claire and back again, recalculating. Claire recognized that expression. He was searching for hidden leverage, a narrative he could still control. Interesting, he said slowly. I guess people surprise you. Sometimes, Claire replied. Mostly when you stop underestimating them. A visible shift moved through the crowd. Not applause. Not confrontation. Just the unmistakable emotional realignment that happens when a room starts reconsidering who the protagonist is. Ethan felt it too. That was why he made his next mistake. "Come on," he said, voice tightening despite his smile. "Let us not pretend this is some dramatic transformation story." Claire said nothing. Ethan stepped off the low stage platform. Closer now, microphone still in hand. "You disappear after the divorce, then reappear in rooms like this, and suddenly everyone is supposed to be impressed." Richard's expression hardened. The event coordinator started moving toward them, uncertain whether intervention was needed. Claire remained completely still. "Ethan," Richard said. "Enough." Ethan should have stopped. Instead, threatened pride pushed him forward. "No. Actually, I would love clarity." He looked directly at Claire. "Since transparency matters." Claire felt the final internal click of certainty. He was going to keep going. Good. Because now there would be no ambiguity about what happened next. She slowly extended her hand. "Then give me the microphone." The room went absolutely silent. Ethan stared at her hand. For a moment, it was almost possible to believe he might refuse. Then pride made the decision for him. With a brittle smile, he placed the microphone in Claire's hand, convinced that whatever she said next could still be managed. Claire took the microphone with steady hands, and that alone unsettled Ethan more than he expected. He had imagined anger, maybe trembling, maybe some emotional speech that would make her look unstable while he appeared composed. What stood in front of him instead was a woman whose calm made everyone else nervous. The ballroom had gone so quiet that the soft clink of glassware from the catering station sounded unusually loud. Claire looked at Ethan for a long moment, not with resentment, not even with triumph, but with the kind of clarity that comes when someone has already finished the emotional argument long before the other person realized there was one. Then she spoke. "Are you absolutely sure you want transparency tonight, Ethan?" The question was simple. Ethan gave a short laugh meant to signal confidence, but it landed thin. "Please," he said. "Go ahead." Claire nodded once. "All right." She looked around the room, not rushing, letting silence work for her in a way Ethan never understood. "I did not come here for this." A few guests shifted. Claire continued. "I came because I was invited for work. I intended to attend quietly, support the cause, and leave." Her tone was controlled, conversational, impossible to frame as emotional retaliation. "But since Ethan has decided tonight should be public, let us be public." Ethan crossed his arms, attempting detachment. Claire turned toward him. "You asked what changed." She paused. "I did." Then came the 7 words. "You only loved me when I stayed small." The sentence landed like a physical silence. Nobody moved. Nobody even pretended to laugh. Ethan's face changed so subtly at first that only someone watching closely would notice. The smile did not vanish immediately. It faltered. His eyes narrowed, not because he was hurt, but because he understood the sentence was true enough to be dangerous. Claire did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "That is what this has always been," she said. "Not closure. Not humor. Not transparency. Control." Ethan scoffed, but it came too quickly. "That is ridiculous." Claire looked toward the audience. "Is it?" Nobody answered. Silence can be more devastating than accusation. Ethan stepped forward slightly. "You are rewriting history." Claire met his gaze. "No. I finally stopped accepting your version of it." Richard remained still, watching. Several guests who had been smiling earlier now looked openly uncomfortable. Claire continued before Ethan could interrupt. "For years, I thought if I explained myself better, reacted less, tried harder, or became easier to manage, things would improve." She gave the smallest shake of her head. "That was my mistake." Ethan laughed again, sharper now. "This is unbelievable." "No," Claire replied evenly. "What was unbelievable was how long I accepted being diminished and called it compromise." A woman near the center table quietly murmured, "Wow." Ethan heard it. Claire saw the flush rising along his neck. "You always loved audiences," Claire said. "Just only when they were facing your direction." Ethan pointed toward her, abandoning subtlety. "That is enough." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Interesting. I thought we wanted transparency." A few guests actually smiled at that. The momentum had fully shifted. Ethan realized it too late. "You are making a scene," he snapped. Claire almost laughed at the irony. "I was standing quietly by the entrance." That line drew a soft wave of knowing reaction from the crowd. Ethan's polished composure was eroding in real time. "You think this proves something?" he asked. Claire answered calmly. "No, your behavior already did." Then the second shift arrived. The event coordinator approached Richard and quietly handed him a tablet. Richard reviewed something, then looked toward Ethan with an expression that changed from skepticism to cold certainty. Ethan noticed. "What is this?" he asked. Richard did not answer immediately. Claire did. "The reason I checked my phone earlier." Ethan stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Claire lowered the microphone slightly. "I told you. I came here for work." Ethan's expression hardened. "Meaning?" Richard stepped forward at last. "Meaning tonight included donor review conversations involving several strategic partnership candidates." Ethan blinked. "And?" Richard's voice remained calm. "And public conduct matters." Ethan laughed once, too loudly. "You cannot be serious." Claire watched realization begin assembling in his face. Not complete understanding. Just fragments. Enough to make him uneasy. "This is because of one awkward joke?" Ethan asked. Richard's tone sharpened. "This is because of repeated conduct in a room full of witnesses." Ethan turned toward the audience as though seeking support, but found mostly averted eyes. The social arithmetic had changed. Nobody wanted to be associated with what now looked undeniably ugly. "Come on," Ethan said. "Everyone knows this is being blown out of proportion." No one rushed to agree. Claire felt something unexpected then. Not satisfaction. Relief. Because for the first time, she was watching the truth exist publicly without having to beg anyone to see it. Ethan looked back at her. "You planned this." Claire answered honestly. "No. I prepared for the possibility that you would be exactly who you have always been." That line hit harder than shouting ever could have. Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in years, language failed him. Richard handed the tablet back to the coordinator. "Ethan," he said, "I think tonight should end here." "You cannot humiliate me over this," Ethan said. Claire nearly smiled at the accidental self-awareness in that sentence. Richard replied evenly. "Nobody made you take a microphone." The room held still for another beat. Then someone near the back quietly began clapping. Just once. Then stopped, embarrassed. But the emotional signal had already gone out. This was over. Ethan looked around the ballroom like a man discovering too late that charisma is not immunity. Claire handed the microphone back to the coordinator instead of Ethan. That mattered. She was done performing inside his framework. As she turned to leave, Ethan said the one thing prideful people say when consequences arrive. "This is not what it looks like." Claire paused, glanced back, and answered softly enough that only those closest heard her. "That has always been your favorite sentence." Then she kept walking, unaware that the most consequential part of the evening had not happened yet. Claire had almost reached the ballroom doors when she heard Richard call her name. She turned, expecting a quiet farewell, but his expression suggested unfinished business. Ethan stood several feet away, still trying to recover his footing with anyone willing to meet his eye. Very few were. Richard crossed the polished floor and stopped beside Claire. "One moment," he said. Then he turned toward Ethan. "There is something else you should know." The room, already emotionally exhausted, seemed to freeze again. Ethan exhaled sharply. "What now?" Richard's tone remained measured. "Your firm was under consideration for a regional development partnership discussion next quarter." Ethan straightened instantly, clinging to familiar territory. "Exactly. Then you understand this should not be confused with personal drama." Richard held his gaze. "It is not being confused." Ethan's confidence faltered. Richard continued. "Character assessment is part of every serious partnership conversation." The meaning landed slowly, then all at once. Ethan looked around as if searching for a witness who might reinterpret reality in his favor. None appeared. "You cannot make a decision based on one moment," he said. Richard answered with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided. "One moment reveals more than a polished presentation ever does." Silence followed. Ethan looked toward Claire, but not with anger this time. With disbelief. As though the impossible part was not the consequence, but the fact that she had become someone whose presence carried weight in rooms he valued. Claire understood that expression. It was the face of a man confronting a narrative collapse. "Claire," Ethan said, voice lower now, stripped of performance. "You really did all this?" Claire considered the question. "No," she said. "You did." That was the truth of it. She had not engineered his humiliation. She had simply stopped protecting him from the natural consequences of his own behavior. Richard gave Claire a small nod, the kind reserved for equals rather than protégés. "We should go," he said. Claire walked with him toward the exit, heels quiet against marble flooring, while behind them conversation slowly resumed in cautious fragments. Outside, the Chicago night carried the crisp, cool air of early fall. City lights reflected off black sedans lined along the curb. For the first time in years, Claire felt no need to replay every interaction in her head, searching for what she should have said differently. She had said exactly enough. Richard glanced at her as they reached the sidewalk. "For what it is worth," he said, "that was remarkably restrained." Claire smiled, genuinely this time. "That is growth." Richard laughed softly. A valet pulled forward a waiting car. As Claire stepped toward it, she looked once through the ballroom windows. Ethan was still inside, still standing under the same chandeliers where he had expected applause. But the difference was simple now. He was no longer the center of her story, and that, more than anything else, was the part he would never know how to control.